Well, here we are. We've finally reached the grand finale of the 1816 Year Without a Summer series. Now, it may not be summer anymore, but as we're dead smack in the middle of spooky season, I can't think of a better time to celebrate the masterpiece that's known as Frankenstein. Today on History by the Book.
Oh, it's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
This is the story you've heard about, talked about. The spine-tingling, blood-chilling story that stuns your emotions. Frankenstein.
Now, Frankenstein may be over 200 years old, but it's still one of the most widely read novels in history. As a matter of fact, the story is so well known that you don't even have to read the book to know what the story is about. But I would highly encourage you to do so because all the films just don't do it justice, and it certainly doesn't give you the sublime experience you get when you read a masterpiece. Now, Mary's inspiration for Frankenstein would come from a couple of different sources. Her own personal experiences, the ghost stories read that fateful night by Lord Byron, and also, as Mary wrote, the conversations between Lord Byron and Shelley, to which I was a devout but nearly silent listener. And if you're wondering what those conversations were about, I'm going to tell you in a minute. But first, if I could ask if you would take less than a minute to hit the like and subscribe button, because that really helps me out a lot. Now, on with the story. I guess the first question I have is, why was an 18-year-old girl cooped up in a house with two of the world's most notorious poets? I mean, for most teenage girls, that would be like a fantasy, a dream come true. But for Mary, it was anything but. Now, Mary was born in 1797 to William Godwin and pioneering feminist Mary Wollstonecraft. Now, Mary and William had based their philosophies on the events and ideas that came out of the French Revolution, and they were considered quite radical for the time. Sadly, Mary would never get to know her mother, because Mary Wollstonecraft died shortly after giving birth to Mary. And this wasn't an uncommon thing because medical hygiene really wasn't a thing back then. And the loss of Mary's mother would haunt her for the rest of her life. Now, Mary did have a stepsister, and her name was Fanny Imlay, and she was the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft and American Gilbert Imlay. And 4 years after the death of her mother, she would gain another stepsister, and that would be Claire Claremont. Now, through all this, Mary became very attached to her father, and Godwin could be sometimes cold and unaffectionate, but he was undoubtedly proud of Mary, stating that Mary was considerably superior in capacity to the one her mother had before. And he also went on to describe Mary as being very pretty, whereas Fanny was by no means handsome. Ouch. Now, the second Mrs. Godwin made Mary's life pretty miserable. Mary was definitely not a fan. She stated that she would actually shudder at just the thought of her, and just mentioning her was enough to bring up feelings of disgust. So needless to say, Mary and her mother her stepmother really didn't get on very well. And several of Godwin's friends agreed with Mary. She was really not popular at all. But there must have been some love there because the marriage lasted until Godwin's death 35 years later. Now, not all of Mary's childhood was spent in angst against her stepmother. As a matter of fact, Mary loved books. And the Godwin home often had visitors who were some of the greatest writers of the period. People like William Hazlitt, Charles Lamb, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Now, there's even a story about Mary and Claire hiding behind a couch after they were told to go to bed so that they could listen to Samuel Taylor Coleridge recite Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. But it was in 1814 when a young unknown poet with radical philosophies named Percy Bysshe Shelley visited the Godwin house and captured Mary's heart. And the feeling was mutual. There was only one small problem, though, and that was that Shelley was already married. Now, Mary was besotted with Shelley, and she was miserable at home due to her conflicts with her stepmother. And Shelley desired to get away from his wife Harriet and also his tyrannical father. So during the summer of 1814, Mary and Percy decided to run off to the continent, and they took Claire with them, well, just, for the hell of it. Now, they had this idea of going off to Europe and being free spirits and living almost a commune-like lifestyle, but they failed to find the utopia that they were in search of. So at the end of the summer of 1814, they wound up having to go back home to England. But by 1816, things were getting a little uncomfortable. Mary was disowned by her family for running off with Shelley in the first place. She was starting to find Claire's company unbearable, and Shelley, who had been disinherited by his father, was not only trying to escape Harriet, but also his creditors. Now, in 1816, Mary, Percy, their second son, William, Mary had lost her first baby in 1815, and of course, Claire Claremont headed off back towards the continent. Now, Percy Shelley's idea was to head to Italy, but Claire, who had had an affair with Byron and was now pregnant with his child, convinced Percy and Mary that they should follow Byron to Geneva. Now, needless to say, Byron was absolutely appalled when he saw Claire on his doorstep, but he did form a fast friendship with the Shelleys. Now, Mary seemed to find some happiness in Geneva, writing, "I feel as happy as a new-fledged bird, and can hardly care what twig I fly to, so that I may try out my new-found wings." However, the weather in Geneva, due to the eruption of Mount Tambora the previous year, often kept Mary caged indoors. And it was during one of those evenings when Byron began to read from this book here, Phantasmagoriana, a collection of German ghost stories that had been translated into French. And it was then that Byron challenged each of them to write their own ghost story. Now, Percy began to write some kind of story, but he quickly lost interest in it. And Byron had started to write a vampire story, which he also lost interest in, that Polidori later picked up and finished and published as his own. But Mary, well, she had nothing. She could not come up with an idea. And she quickly grew frustrated with the constant question every morning of whether or not she had come up with a story. But her frustration would be short-lived. Now, Byron, Shelley, and Polidori's late-night discussions about science and philosophy and the secret of life were often centered on galvanism. And that was a theory that was based on experiments by Luigi Galvani, who demonstrated that electrical impulses applied to dead tissue could cause a reaction that would make the muscles contract. And Galvani's nephew, a fellow named Aldini, would take those experiments one step further by applying them to the corpses of executed criminals. Now, this caused all kinds of speculation about the ability for people to bring corpses back to life. Now, combine this idea of bringing the dead back to life along with the resurrection trade or body snatchers, which was in full swing, the thunderstorms that were going on around because of the disruption to the atmosphere from the eruption of Mount Tambora, the images of Byron reading these ghost stories, the death of her mother, and the loss of her child, Mary's subconscious had everything it needed that would give her an idea for her novel. Mary had a horrific nightmare, and she would go on to write about it, stating that I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. Now, Mary's dream frightened her to the point that it woke her up, and she spent a little time looking around the dark room, attempting to find something that would comfort her. And what she did find was that I could not so easily get rid of my hideous phantom. But with fear also came inspiration, as she realized, I have found it. What terrified me will terrify others, and I need only describe the specter that haunted my midnight pillow. What began as a nightmare in the overactive imagination of an 18-year-old girl would become one of literature's greatest novels. Now, Mary shared her dream with Percy, who encouraged her to start writing and to expand on that and make it into a book. And Mary would spend most of 1816 doing exactly that. But the process was also overshadowed and plagued with their own real-life nightmares, including the October 1816 suicide of Mary's stepsister, Fanny Imlay, who was probably also in love with Shelley, and that may have been part of the reason why she did what she did. And just a couple months after that, in December, the very pregnant body of Shelley's wife, Harriet, was found floating in the Serpentine, also an assumed suicide. And at the end of 1816, on December 30th, Mary and Shelley became husband and wife. Now, Mary's creation saw the light of day in 1818 when the novel was published, and it became a bestseller. But not everybody thought it was so great. As a matter of fact, the April 1818 edition of a magazine called The British Critic wrote, when we did not hurry over the pages in disgust, we sometimes paused to laugh outright. And when they discovered that the novel had been written by a woman, they continued with, if our authoress can forget the gentleness of her sex, it is no reason why we should, and we shall therefore dismiss the novel without further comment. However, Mary also received praise in some unexpected places, namely Byron. Now, yes, Byron was a friend of the Shelleys, but Byron was also a misogynistic asshole. And he wasn't one to praise a woman for her intellectual capabilities. So Byron's praise was actually genuine. And Byron stated that methinks it is a wonderful work for a girl of 19. Not 19 indeed at the time. And a reviewer after the 1832 release called it an exhibition of intellectual and imaginative power, which we think the reader will acknowledge has seldom been surpassed. Now, even Mary was a bit surprised by all the attention that her novel attracted. Years later, Mary looked back on it and wrote, "How I, then a young girl, came to think of and to dilate upon so hideous an idea." And of course, we can't have a discussion about Frankenstein without the conspiracy theory that Mary didn't write the book, that Shelley was the one who actually wrote the book. But while Shelley did contribute some editorial assistance in the creation of the book, the story itself was all Mary's own. Now, all the heartbreak that Mary had experienced didn't end with the publication of her novel. Mary and Percy would go on to have 4 children, and only one, Percy Florence Shelley, would live into adulthood. She would also lose her beloved Shelley in a boating accident in 1822, where Shelley would drown and his body washing up days later on the shores of, excuse my pronunciation of this, Viareggio in Italy. Now, once Percy's body had been buried in the sand for, I believe it was 2 weeks, they were able to cremate him on the beach. And Mary wasn't there, but she was later given Percy's heart, which didn't burn. And his heart may have actually been his liver or some other organ. But the important thing is that Mary believed it was his heart, and she kept it in a box in a drawer of her writing desk. And that's where it stayed until her death in 1851, when her son, Percy Florence, found it. And the heart was eventually buried when Percy Florence died in 1889. So there you have it, a brief history of Mary Shelley's creation of Frankenstein. Now, there is so much more to this than the little bit of ground that I've covered in these videos. But if you want to learn more and you're interested in, the roles in the lives of Lord Byron and Percy Bysshe Shelley and Claire Clairmont and John Paul Adori, I have videos on each one of them also on my channel. So if you're interested, go and check those out too. So I want to say thanks for watching, and if you have any ideas on Frankenstein, or if you can think of any modern horror novels that would be kind of on the same level as Frankenstein, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your comments. And thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time on History by the Book. Bye-bye.